Hello, welcome to our discussion now of analogical arguments. So analogical arguments are arguments made based on comparison. In other words, in order to derive the conclusion in an analogical argument, they will analogize or compare one thing to another. And analogical arguments are an inductive form of logical reasoning in which the conclusion only follows with probability, not with necessity. And these arguments can be found in science as well as in moral reasoning, amongst a variety of other different kinds of fields. So basically, the logical structure of an analogical argument is like this. The first premise says something like this: x1s have features f1, f2, f3, etc., and feature fn. We'll understand fn as being a special feature. Second premise says that, well, x2s have features f1, f2, f3. In other words, they have the same features as x1s. In other words, they're analogous in this respect. Well, insofar as x1s and x2s have the same features f1, f2, f3, they appear to be relevantly analogous, and x1s have this additional feature, fn, well then x2s probably have fn. So here we can understand x's as being variables that refer to entities, or things, or acts, or persons, and f's are variables that refer to features or attributes. Let's go as an example. Let's run through a common argument by analogy, right? Maybe you told your parents, I'm going to a party tonight. They said no, and you said, well, everyone's going to be there. And maybe one of your parents said, well, if everyone jumps off a bridge, would you jump off a bridge? That's an analogical argument. It's an argument by analogy. The x1s in this case are everyone is people jumping off of a bridge. And it has the feature that everyone's doing it. And it also has the special feature fn, that you shouldn't do it. x2s in this case is going to the party. And like x1, it has the f1 feature that everyone's doing it. Well, just as insofar as these are analogous, since x1s, or jumping off the bridge, has the feature that you shouldn't do it, x2 has the feature that you don't necessarily have to go to the party. Okay, so let's return to the teleological argument for God's existence. This was an argument by analogy. First premise: a watch has design, purpose, arrangement, and construction. Second premise: everything with design requires an intelligent designer. Third premise: a watch has a designer. Premise 4: analogously, plants, animals, and nature have design, purpose, etc. Therefore, conclusion: nature has an intelligent designer. So I would like for you as an exercise to think, what is the x1? What is the x2? What are the f1s and f2s, etc.? And what is the special feature fn? Well, in this case, the x1 is the watch, right? And the x2 is nature. Those are the two things being analogized. And what does the watch and nature have in common? What are the f1, f2, etc. features? Well, they have design, purpose, arrangement, etc. in common. Well, a watch has the special fn feature of having an intelligent designer design it. That's the special feature that the watch has. So insofar as the watch and nature supposedly share these other properties of design, purpose, and arrangement, they're analogous. So therefore, if the watch has a property of having a designer, nature also has an intelligent designer. So this argument goes. Okay, so let's look at some more technical concepts of the components of an argument by analogy. And there are four main components of such an argument. The analogs, you can think of them as being the x1s. These are the things to which the entities in the conclusion are being compared. The primary subjects are the x2s. These are the things about which a conclusion is being drawn. So in other words, in an argument by analogy, you are comparing two things. You're comparing x1s and x2s. So of the two things you're comparing, one of them is the analog, the other one is the primary subject. How do you determine which is which? Well, the thing that's being compared, that's talked about in the conclusion, in other words, you're drawing a conclusion about that thing, that is the primary subject. And then by default, the other thing that's in the analogy is the analog. Next, let's discuss similarities. Similarities are the F1, F2, F3, etc. features that the premises claim are shared by the analog and the primary subject. So notice the premises will implicitly or explicitly be stating that the analog and the primary subject, the two things being compared, share these things in common. In other words, the premises say that they're analogous in this respect and that they share these features. The conclusory feature is the special feature, right? It is the FN feature, and this is the feature in the argument's conclusion that's claimed to be a feature of the primary subject or primary object. So here we can understand the conclusory feature as in the premises, it should say that the analog has the conclusory feature, but the primary subject is attributed with having the conclusory feature only in the conclusion. So the conclusory feature is a feature that is contained in the conclusion. We should see it in the conclusion as being attributed to the primary subject. All right, so in order to identify whether or not you are being presented with an analogical argument or not, look for a comparison being made. Are there two things trying to be compared? Also, what needs to be there needs to be an analog and a primary subject, in other words, two things being compared. There also needs to be similarities, right, stated in the premises. The analog and the primary subject have these things in common. They're similar in these respects. And there must be a conclusory feature, where in the conclusion it says, given that they're analogous, therefore the primary subject has this conclusory feature, since the analog has this feature. Okay, so we should also watch out to make sure that sometimes there are analogies that are not argumentative analogies. They're not arguments by analogy, but they may be illustrative analogies. And an illustrative analogy is an analogy used to help people understand something instead of being used to make an argument. So an argument by analogy is not being presented, but rather it might be some kind of tool to help people maybe understand something. For example, a lot of times when people use metaphors, these are illustrative analogies. Someone might say, love is as beautiful as a rose. Right? Someone might be wondering, is love a good thing? Is it beautiful? Is it nice to have? And someone might say in response that love is as beautiful as a rose. Here, there are two things being analogized, love and a rose, insofar as they're having beauty. So you might think that there's love and a rose, they're being analogized, they have features in common, in other words, they have a similarity, namely being beautiful, but there's nothing here, there's no conclusory feature here, where there's a conclusion that says, well, since the rose has this, therefore love has this. There's nothing like that here. So all the four components are not present in this illustrative analogy. Therefore, this is merely an illustrative analogy. It is not an argument by analogy. So illustrative analogies may have analogs, they may have primary subjects, and may have similarities, but there is no conclusory feature. In other words, there is no attempt to make an argument by analogy. Okay, so let's go through some problems. Let's look at each one of these and determine whether it is an analogical argument. Right? An analogical argument, not necessarily something else like an illustrative analogy. Number one, life is like a bowl of cherries. Here there is an analogy comparing life to a bowl of cherries, but there is no conclusory feature. This is not an argument by analogy. There's no feature saying, well, therefore, since the bowl of cherries has this feature and the bowl of cherries is similar to life, life therefore has this conclusory feature. There's nothing like that going on here. So this is not an argument by analogy. And number two, the weather in Atlanta is hotter than the weather in Boston. I like the weather in Atlanta. My best friend likes the weather in Boston. Is this an argument by analogy? Well, if anything, there might be an analogy made between Atlanta and Boston, or maybe yourself and your best friend. However, there are no similarities, right? There's nothing saying here that Atlanta and Boston have similar weather. Rather, it's saying they have different weather. One is hotter than the other. And if there was an attempt to make an argument by analogy based on yourself and your best friend, there is no similarity being stated, right? There's differences. You like weather in Atlanta, and your best friend likes the weather in Boston. So there is no argument by analogy here. There is no similarities, right? Remember, argument by analogy contains 4 of those main components. Let's look at number 3. The planets are attracted to the sun in inverse proportion to the square of their distance from the sun, and they revolve around the sun in orbits. Electrons are attracted to the nucleus of an atom in inverse proportion to the square of their distance from the nucleus. So it seems likely that electrons revolve around the nucleus in orbits. This is an argument by analogy. There are 2 things being compared here, planets as well as electrons. Let's kind of go through the 4 main components of the argument. So what we should do first here is we should find the 2 things that are being analogized. That might be the simplest thing to do. So the 2 things being analogized are planets and electrons. Now we should determine which feature is the primary subject and which object is the primary subject and which of these objects is the analog. Remember, the primary subject is the subject that's being analogized that will be found in the conclusion. It's what you're drawing a conclusion about. Well, when we look at the conclusion, we see the indicator word there in the last sentence, so. And that is properly used here as an indicator word, that what follows after it is the conclusion. It seems likely that electrons revolve around the nucleus in orbits. Here, of the 2 things being compared, electrons are in the conclusion. That's what we're drawing a conclusion about. Therefore, it is the primary subject, and then by default, planets are then the analog. Next, let's look for what features they have in common. It says planets are attracted to the sun in inverse proportion to the square of their distance from the sun. Electrons are, and if we move further down in the passage, it says electrons are attracted to the nucleus of an atom in inverse proportion to the square of their distance from the nucleus. So the similarities are what the premises state are the things that the 2 things you're analogizing have in common. What are the similarities, or in other words, features that they have in common? And this will be stated in the premise, not in the conclusion. So what it says in the premises that they have in common is in regards to the inverse proportion to the square of their distance from a relevant object. Their kind of attraction either to the nucleus of an atom or to the sun, right? It's in regard, what they have in common is this kind of quality of irrelevance to the inverse proportion to the square of their distance. Okay, so that's what they have in common. What is the conclusory feature? The conclusory feature is the feature that's attributed to the primary subject in the conclusion. So the conclusion says, so it seems likely that electrons revolve around the nucleus in orbits. So revolving around the nucleus in orbits is the conclusory feature. And we should see the conclusory feature being only attributed to the analog in the premise. And that's what we do see at the end of the first sentence when it says they revolve around the sun in orbits. Right? Planets revolve around the sun in orbits. So essentially how the argument goes, planets and electrons, they're similar in that they have this kind of relationship of in regards to an inverse proportion to the square of their distance from a relevant object. So that's why they're analogous. So since they're analogous, well, planets revolve around the sun in orbits, therefore electrons must revolve around the nucleus in orbits. Okay, so what are the 4 components of this analogical argument? Monkeys and humans are medium-sized mammals and they live in groups. When monkeys are given substance X, they show reaction R. Consequently, if administered substance X, humans will show reaction R. So first, let's find the two things being analogized. Well, those are monkeys and humans, right? Those are the two things being compared. So now we should determine which one is the primary subject and which one is the analog. The primary subject is what we're drawing a conclusion about. Let's look at the conclusion. Well, consequently, that is a very strong indicator word that what follows it is the conclusion. If administered substance X, humans will show reaction R. So here we're drawing a conclusion about humans. So humans are the primary subject, and then therefore by default, monkeys are the analog. Okay, so next let's look at the similarities. Once again, these are the features that the analog and primary subject have in common and that are stated in the premises. So let's look at the first premise. Monkeys and humans are medium-sized mammals and they live in groups. Oh, right there we have our similarities. Both of them are analogous because they're medium-sized mammals and they live in groups. What is the conclusory feature? The conclusory feature will be attributed to the analog in the premise, but it will only be attributed to the primary subject in the conclusion. Well, we can turn to the conclusion. We know that the conclusion is about humans. And what feature is attributed to humans? Well, the conclusory feature is that if administered substance X, humans reaction R will ensue, will follow. And we see that this conclusory feature is attributed to monkeys. When we look at the second sentence, it says, when monkeys are given substance X, they show reaction R. Right, so that conclusory feature is attributed to analogs in the premises, but it's not attributed to the primary subject in the premises. Right, it's only attributed to the primary subject in the conclusion, whereas the similarities are attributed to both the primary subject as well as the analog in the premises. All right, and so with that concludes our introduction so far in regards to analogs, and the next lesson will look even deeper into arguments by analogy.